Tonight's Fireside CharLA is brought to you in partnership with United Latinx Fund and Latino Coalition of Los Angeles. This online event series aims to engage, educate, and advocate on important and timely topics that impact LA's Latinx community during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as how, as a community, we can address some of the most emerging and important social justice issues, such as police violence. I'd like to quickly thank sponsors of tonight's event, Southern California Gas Company and JP Morgan Chase, for their commitment to and investment in nonprofits like United Latinx Fund that work to transform, uplift, and improve our community's quality of life. Our program is designed to engage you, our audience. So if you have questions, please enter your questions in the chat box. And note that everybody's audio and video will be muted until the Q&A session. Also, tonight's program is streaming on Facebook Live. So to access that video, you can go ahead and turn on the Latino Coalition of Los Angeles' Facebook page. And Cindy, if you could provide a link in the chat box to the Latino Coalition's page. And then also, Cindy, you can activate the Facebook Live function through Zoom's administrative panel by entering the Facebook Live credentials, and that will activate the session. Thank you, Cindy, for providing the URL in the chat box. Tonight, we are very excited to have with us a leading expert on political and electoral political representation, Dr. Gary Segura, an esteemed researcher who has over 18 years of direct experience with polling research, and he's completed over 100,000 interviews of Americans of all backgrounds on matters of political importance, and we're thrilled to host him tonight to discuss how the Latinx vote is faring in the upcoming election and the issues and messaging that is resonating with the Latinx community. Thank you for joining us, Dean Segura. And before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to take a moment to commend you for launching and helping to get off the ground the Latino Policy and Politics Initiative at UCLA within your first year as Dean, and in collaboration with ULF's former board president, Sonia Diaz, in which this important initiative utilizes a multi-pronged approach to ensure that Latinos and other communities of color have a seat at the decision-making table and fair opportunities to thrive. We'd like to recognize the initiative's academic influence on advocacy, mobilization, leadership, and research. Thank you, Dean, for your leadership on LPPI. And now to the discussion. Dean Segura, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me, Richard. I appreciate it. And thanks for shouting out to LPPI, who's doing the good work in many different areas of policy and advocacy.
Absolutely. And your pace is perfect for our interpreters, but if we could get you to speak up just a little bit louder, because we are recording and I want to make sure that we have you for posterity and folks can hear you well. And let's get to the conversation. In comparison to previous election cycles, what are the unique and defining characteristics and challenges being faced by this year's Latinx electorate?
So, as you know, as well as I do, the Latino electorate in the United States is a very diverse population. And the idea that it's just Mexican Americans in Los Angeles is really quite antiquated. We used to think about three big groups: Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Mexicans. But the Latino population has become so diverse that we find groups like Venezuelans in South Florida exercising influence over outcomes in ways that we wouldn't have expected otherwise. If I wanted to identify the things I think are really the most interesting this year, I'd point to several, say 4 or 5 items that deserve comment. The first is the Puerto Rican population in Central Florida. Everybody's aware of the Hurricane Maria tragedy and the incredible disadvantages and difficulties faced by the island's population after Maria, and an almost complete lack of support from the federal government, and actually intentional withholding of support from the federal government. As a consequence, about 230,000 Puerto Rican adults have moved from the island to Central Florida. They moved to the most competitive battleground state over the last 30 years. And so it's really interesting to see that they might have an effect. The effect isn't always what you think it might be. 2 years ago, Senator Nelson lost his seat, in part because he paid very little attention to Latino outreach, and because then Governor Scott, now Senator Scott, invested in building relationships with that Puerto Rican population. Vice President Biden is not making any such error. And so what you've seen from the vice president's campaign is a substantial effort and investment, not just in Puerto Ricans and Cubans, the dominant populations in Florida, but even among Venezuelans, which is honestly a tough sell for Democrats because they have a very strong sort of anti-socialist notion after Maduro. And so that's one sort of new thing. A second new thing I'd point to is the Latino influence in, drumroll please, Pennsylvania. Yes, ladies and gentlemen. Southeastern Pennsylvania has a substantial Latino population, overwhelmingly Puerto Rican, again. Now, there are Mexicans in Pennsylvania, largely scattered through the central and western portions of the state. But the real population concentration is Puerto Ricans and a smaller Dominican population in and around the city of Philadelphia. They are, again, on a razor's edge state and have the opportunity to be a very important population. The third place I'd look would be South Texas. So we've all been waiting for the population bomb to make Texas competitive. And in fact, that bomb may be starting to detonate. My colleague Matt Barreto has done some calculations, and between the 2016 election and today, about 730,000 Latino Texans have turned 18 and entered the eligible electorate. That's a lot of young people. Now, young people don't vote as often as we might like them to, but if there's a chance that Texas flips, if not in 20, then perhaps in 22 or 24, what's happening in South Texas with the population chart is really what's going to matter. And the last place I'd look is Arizona. Like its neighbors, Nevada and Colorado before it, Arizona is finally reaching that tipping point where the Latino electorate is large enough and activated enough, and importantly, invested in enough by candidates and parties to turn them out. The current predictions are that Arizona will elect its second Democratic senator, that they will cast their electoral votes for a Democrat, and the Democrats could take the lower chamber of the state legislature. So you're talking about a really massive political swing in Arizona, and Latinos are behind it.
I love how you basically sort of walked us across a map of the United States and highlighted four important races in which not only Latinos can make an impact at the national level, but even at the state level. And, you know, Dean Segura, I always hear, I always feel like we're a similar conversation is had every 4 years, right? I feel like, there's always this conversation around, oh, it's almost there, and this could be, and the margins are close, and the numbers, and they're almost there, and then we have, the outcomes, that we have. So, to that point, what issues and messaging are resonating with Latinx locally and nationally? And of course, underneath that question, I'm trying to get at, what needs to be said to get those margins moving in the directions that we would like to see?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, we ask people all the time in our surveys, what's the most important issue that you'd like the president and Congress to address? It varies over time. Historically, it was education, public safety, and jobs and wages. And more recently, healthcare has come in. During the 2000s, the Iraq War was very salient, and immigration's always in the top 5 or so. This year, it's very different. The number one response of our respondents, by more than 2 to 1 over the second place number, is COVID, 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 COVID. Latinos are suffering horribly under the COVID epidemic. It is a double-edged sword. It's catching them coming and going. On the one hand, millions of Latinos have lost their job. By our estimate in our polling, about 26% of Latino households have either lost a job or seen their wages drop because of reduced hours or reduced pay across the United States. And for those people who are still working, they are incredibly vulnerable to interpersonal contact and transmission of the COVID-19 virus. So much so that Latinos overrepresent their population share in both cases and fatalities in all of the major Latino population states. In some of these Midwestern farm states, in fact, pretty much the only people who are dying are Latinos who are working in meat processing plants and agricultural processing plants where there's no social distancing and where the government's paying no attention to them. So it's been just an absolutely horrible impact, and that's the number one issue by far.
So knowing that, COVID is the number one issue, and knowing that we have these sort of margins in some critical swing states, right? Can you share with us in terms of what would you do to kind of fuse those two pieces of information together, right? To move an agenda forward, assuming you would have an agenda. How would you fuse that messaging around COVID, and then the importance of the Latino vote in the particular states that you identified early on?
So among the other top 5 issues is healthcare, which is obviously related to COVID. And the narrative that I would pursue from a rhetorical standpoint has to do with tying the vulnerability of the population to COVID-19 to 3 states where Medicaid expansion did not take place under the Affordable Care Act, and the attempt on the part of the current administration to kill the Affordable Care Act, which would turn 24 million Americans off of their health insurance, and a disproportionate number of those being Latino. So you tie incredible physical health vulnerability to either the absence of insurance options in places like Florida and Texas, or the preliminary presence of those options that could in fact be or contingent because of this legal challenge. I would make that the central narrative. We spend a lot of time talking about Trump's racism, but at some level that's cooked into the books. Like, we all know that. So that's, anyone who's going to be moved by Trump's racism knows about it and was moved about it. We need to actually talk more affirmatively about what we can do for Latino families and Latino populations. And things like healthcare, quality education, closing the digital divide, which during COVID has become a huge problem for people who have children trying to attend school when they don't have broadband in their household. Like, these are impossibilities. These are bread and butter issues. And these are the types of things that move people to the polls.
And, I've heard, even in sort of previous campaign cycles, that, bread and butter issues are Latino issues. All issues are Latino issues. And to a certain extent, for better or for worse, some of these issues and topics that get a lot of buzz and get a lot of attention and get a lot of media aren't necessarily resonating with the Latinx electorate. And the issues that maybe aren't as sexy, don't get as much headlines, aren't as splashy, really are the things that are most compelling to our community, and potentially would be able to change the outcome. And I've heard this many times before, and it seems it's a bit of a catch-22, in the sense that it seems so relatively easy that it's emerging as something that's seemingly difficult, and I'm not sure why exactly that is. couple things. We do have some questions. I did want to give still Cindy some time to try to address the Facebook Live issue. So Cindy, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and move into the Q&A session. I'm going to ask a few questions. We have Luisa Oyage, our good friend from the county of Los Angeles, who's now working with Supervisor Janice Hahn. And I'm wondering if we can activate Luisa and her as a, let's see if I can make her, oh, I don't have the administrative privilege, but I will ask Luisa's question and then-
I'm making her panelist right now. She will be joining.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Cindy. The question is redistricting. This is something that many of us are already beginning to think about and prepare for, in light of the fact that today is the last day that the census will be conducted. Of course, the census will be utilized to inform redistricting, and it's going to be a significant endeavor here in LA County and of course throughout the state. Dean Segura, what are your, would be your recommendations to policymakers and things that they should be aware of? Luisa has some concerns that the county will not create another Latino district potentially. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to share a little bit about your thoughts about advice for many of us who are going to be involved in this effort, and then I'll let Luisa chime in.
So Luisa, the fight over the districting in Los Angeles County is like the perennial, it's like Don Quixote and
Yes.
the windmill. And for whatever reason, the windmill always wins. And it's getting tiresome. We have worked, I personally was part of a team that worked on this 10 years ago to try to force the county to draw an additional majority Latino district. Everyone needs to remember now that this county in this count, even with Trump's manipulation, will be over 50% Latino. And so our County Board of Supervisors can and must reflect that, as should the city councils of not just the city of Los Angeles, but even the at-large elected smaller cities. We want representation that reflects our population. And part of that's maintaining and litigating and trying to reinforce the California Voting Rights Act. Part of that's pulling together the right expert group to raise the challenge should an additional Latino majority district not be drawn for the Board of Supervisors. And then we have a bigger issue, which is not so much a local one because that's a different set of line drawers, but on the statewide level, Latinos were almost entirely walled out of the statewide redistricting commission. They were in the first round, and it wasn't until the appointed round, the second round, that Latinos were represented there in a state that's 40% Latino. Mm-hmm. And we need to start litigating these things. I'm proud to say that at UCLA, we started the UCLA Voting Rights Project as part of LPPI, and VRP has been in litigation in California and elsewhere, including Washington State and in Texas against Governor Abbott, trying to protect the right to vote and the right to representation for Latinos. But I think it's a perennial issue, and I'm interested to hear your perspective.
Absolutely. 2010, as you know, Gary, I recruited you to be part of the legal team. I wish we can do that again. I think the fight is going to be more intense this time. I think the county will reflect the same issues that the state did with the commissioners. The list will be revealed tomorrow. Let me just tell you, it doesn't look like wow with the Latino representation on the list. And you know what? It should be infuriating to all of us, Richard and everybody here, that we're not at the table. 2020, we're still not at the table. 2020, we're still a silent majority. 2020, I'm still the highest ranking Latina on the 8th floor, and it shouldn't be the case. And I think it's important to making sure that your voting rights folks are armed enough to put up the fight, because last time, you know, the county did hire the attorneys who represented a lot of the Republican districts, and they're back on again. And it's all self-preservation.
Right. It's all self-preservation. We need to call out members of the Board of Supervisors who are actively supporting this and make it clear that while they claim to play Democrat on TV, that in fact they're using Republican lawyers to dilute minority votes. We need to file for injunctive relief at every stage of the process.
Yes.
Because this is something that has been ongoing. It's unacceptable. And the county has to know that this year's census is going to provide them very little defensive space. There won't be 3 Latino majority districts, but there damn well better be 2, or they're going to be sued in court. And that suit, we don't even need the CVRA to do it. We could sue in federal court under Section 2 violation. So we can bring 2 suits against these people. And I'm happy to do that.
I welcome you guys to do the first suit tomorrow morning.
So
Look forward to it.
when we were doing our dry run, Luisa, I had mentioned that there have been significant outcomes to these CharLAs. And I was giving Gary some examples of policies and next steps that have emerged. So I'm thinking, I'm hearing some next steps that are being discussed today.
Tomorrow will be the day.
Tomorrow will be the day. There
Luisa,
it is.
I know you have contact information on Matt Barreto. You should text him sooner rather than later. And our lead litigator is a guy named Chad Dunn, who was the guy who represented LULAC in the case against Governor Abbott. So please, by all means, reach out.
I'll do that for Matt. Okay, perfect.
And a follow-up question, because I'm looking to see if there's any other questions. But I mean, it would be nice in theory, right, to have more of a proactive effort when it comes to outreaching and engaging to certain communities to be on the statewide or local either or commissions. And, you know, I'll be honest, I did, receive the announcements. And in my head, and clearly I won't make this mistake again, but in my head, I'm like, oh yeah, there's definitely going to be, I mean, if I got it, then clearly, many other people got it. And there's going to be a robust engagement and robust application process. And it's going to be, very well represented. And I was completely wrong.
Didn't turn out that way at the state level.
Sorry?
And tomorrow, the county level.
Yeah. Correct. What's up with that? I mean, is everybody thinking the way that I am, or is it that they're really, the outreach isn't that great? Or what's going on there?
I think that there's a couple things going on. Full disclosure, I was asked to serve on the city's redistricting commission, and I passed. I passed because, there are only 24 hours in a day, right? And so part of the problem is that a number of us who have expertise in this area are wildly overtaxed. And so if I want to talk about, when would the time have been right to make the push on the state or on the county, the time would have been right 4 or 5 months ago. But many of us at that time were engaged in COVID-related activities, litigation around the census, trying to keep the census citizenship question off. We did that last year. The types of things, the numbers of places where we're fighting multiple front battles is enormous. And so yes, I was given the opportunity to serve on the city's commission, and I didn't do it. I didn't do it because my children already dislike me. I don't want to be that person. But I can't be the only deal in town. And there's probably, there's 24 Latino social scientists in this town who are perfectly capable of doing this. And so I think that's part of the problem, is that we need to be far more proactive at every level. And someone needs to be principally focused on this. And, MALDEF has been principally focused on these sorts of issues historically, but MALDEF is completely piled under with the number of fronts that they're fighting on right now. So, much love to Tom and his team, because they're just, again, they have this many dollars and this many people, and they're fighting everywhere they can.
Luisa, I'm wondering, because ULF is a philanthropy, I'm wondering if we need to do something along the lines of what they do for commissions, right? So starting now, beginning to put together like these boot camps or these institutes that prepare folks well in advance, maybe as part of LPPI, maybe a joint venture with LPPI, ULF, and California Community Foundation, where we begin to train locally and statewide folks with the expertise who have more time than we do, and who maybe are younger and possibly graduate students, who are engaged civically, but would also need that additional expertise. And it's something that I think is a worthwhile investment in numerous ways, too many ways to count, possibly. In the same way the commissions have been more aptly represented, I think the same could hold true.
We'd be happy to help you with that, but as you know, and as Louisa knows, this is a little bit different than commission service because it's fairly technical, right? So you have to have a set of folks who have some mathematical fluency, who are familiar a little bit with sort of geospatial analysis, sort of mapping where people live to how they're represented. Right. And then it would help to know a little bit about what's going on in the law and what's going on in the political science. So for example, we know that 50% plus one is not enough to carry a district for a minority group. We need probably more in the neighborhood of 65%. We also know that 90 to 100% districts are bad for minority groups because it's diluting their vote through concentration rather than through dilution. So I'm happy to help with that. And I know Sonia would be happy to help with that. And I suspect Matt and Chad would too.
Right.
This is something that we could build a coalition around to really change the way we think about these things. And by the way, census or no, redistricting or no, we can go to court on much of these things. Like we can change the way these districts look, even and especially if they're drawn adversely to our interests.
Yeah. Again, tomorrow will be the day you can do your first lawsuit.
I'll let them know.
And that's why I was thinking.
The county has deep pockets. You know that. We're $38 billion strong.
Yeah, a lot of that money's spoken for right now.
Not really.
Oh, well, that's the case.
Well, I was just saying that's why I thought graduate students would kind of be, eligible sort of candidates with additional supports prior, leading them up to, the big moment. So if I could get our administrators to please invite everybody over in as panelists and migrate them over because we're going to wrap up the formal part of tonight's program and we're going to transition to the mixer. And while we do that, while we migrate over, I do always want to take a moment to thank our panelist who's not going anywhere, but I wanted to thank him for his time and his leadership and his thoughts in a variety of different ways. And we really come full circle because as some of you may know, Dean Segura actually kicked off our first ever Salon series back in 2017, I believe it was in 2017. It was the first year that you were the dean at the Luskin School of Public Affairs, and we had invited you to do a Salon series, the first ever, and it's fast forward now 3 years, almost 4 years later, we have you back now in a virtual environment, and it's great always to reconnect with you, although under unintended circumstances, it's the work and the leadership is much appreciated. So thank you for that, Dean Segura. And then also, our pleasure. And then also, I always want to announce our next CharLA next Thursday, which is a very exciting, I think, in a very special sort of commemorative CharLA series because we're going to be making I guess it would be the first official public announcement of our media partnership with a very prominent and well-known online Latinx-focused publication. But I will save the detail for next Thursday so that you can come back. But we're very excited to share this media partnership, which is really going to elevate our work and our platform, both for the Latino Coalition and the United Latinx Fund. So please tune in next Thursday, where you'll meet our new media partners. And then as a first opportunity to partner and communicate on our collective work, we're going to be also sharing a piece of content that we've developed that showcases the work of our young social impact, Gen Z, millennial social impact consultants that have been working with the Latino Coalition and United Latinx Fund on various initiatives that we've been working on really since COVID, and using leadership, politics, and policy at the nexus of those three pillars to affect change that's necessary and that impacts the communities that we care about most and the communities that we represent. So we're so proud to share our young social impact consultants, their work, their stories. You can hear from them about how this work has impacted them, their professional careers, and their lives, and then how that story will then be shared by this prominent online media publication. So please join us next Thursday for that very exciting celebration.